Today, I'm really excited to have architectural photographer Michael J. Lee here with me from Boston, Massachusetts. Michael grew up in New Jersey and moved to Boston to attend Wentworth Institute of Technology. After receiving a Bachelor of Science in Interior Design, he worked for 16 years as a design associate for two of New England Home's Hall of Fame designers, Celeste Cooper and then Richard Fitzgerald. In 2007, Michael J. Lee Photography LLC was launched to infuse Michael's architectural and design vocabulary with the technical skills needed to produce consistent, polished images. Michael sees photography as both a solitary art and a collaborative craft in which something is always happening, and his excellent photography was recently featured in the October 2014 issue of Professional Photographer magazine. So hi Michael, I'm really excited to have you here with us today.
Hi, Nigel. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. And today's topic is all about the artistry and craft of architectural and design photography, which is a highly specialized field indeed, but really interesting and exciting. So what was that initial spark of inspiration for you that got you started in professional photography and in architectural photography specifically?
Well, in truth, I could spend most of the interview answering that. It was a culmination of many things that happened all around 2005, 2006 that led me to decide to change careers from interior design to architectural photography. My wife and I had our first child together. My boss had announced that he was retiring and closing the company, so I had to make a decision about what my future would be. And then one of my biggest design projects was going to be photographed by a magazine. And the photographer, Richard Mandelkorn, is someone that I knew when I worked with Celeste Cooper, because Celeste Cooper was very interested in always photographing and documenting work, while Richard Fitzgerald really wasn't. So I actually hadn't been on a photo shoot in probably 13, 14 years. And so a lot of what was happening that day on the shoot with Mr. Mandelkorn sparked something in me, I believe.
And so what you were doing at that time was documenting these interior design projects, essentially.
Yes.
I understand that you're self-taught with photography. You haven't had any sort of formal education in that.
I'll be the first to admit I've never been in a dark room. Up until then, I had never had a real camera, only had point and shoots, and I just did a tremendous amount of reading and just making mistakes and learning. And I was also very fortunate that when I decided to do this, my boss, Richard Fitzgerald, we had about 9 months before the company was to officially close, and he basically said, call up all of our clients and go practice. And that was a tremendous help.
Well, obviously that paid off because the work that I saw from you in the Professional Photographer magazine was of an incredibly high standard, and obviously you put a lot of effort and attention to detail in that. And it seemed obvious to me from looking at the work that you have a particular type of client that you prefer to work with. What can you tell us about your ideal clients, and what do you see as the main factors that make you a great choice for them as opposed to other photographers for their projects?
Well, most of my clients are interior designers. I work with a few architects, a few builders, but I think that we honestly just simply share a common language. Having been in the trenches, so to speak, with my peers, those designers in my other former life, I kind of know a lot about the background of what goes on between designer and client. Oftentimes, I think one of my strongest suits is that when I go into a home, within reason, most designers don't get 100% with their client. And so when I go into these homes, I can kind of tell pretty quickly what the designer did and what maybe the designer had to inherit. And so I can be sensitive to that and know what to shoot around and what to highlight. And I think they appreciate that.
So what you're saying then is that all this work that you did for 16 years as a designer really gives you an edge when it comes to working with these people.
It helped me to train my eye to see quality and beauty and sophistication, yes.
When you're photographing architecture, particularly when working inside the building, how does it work from the perspective of the interior design? I mean, for example, do you bring in your own designers to stage a scene, or are you working with designers who already have a project that they're working on and they need someone to come and photograph it?
In the best case scenario, a designer and an architect and builder have completed a wonderful project, and so I'm contacted to go photograph that. And so I'm working very intimately with the designer, architect, or builder on the shoot, making decisions sort of in real time as we are guided by the image that gets projected onto a 15-inch laptop that we're tethered to. And so the designer and architect and I are making these decisions as we work through a day of photography. Typically, if you're working on a magazine shoot, they will maybe bring in a stylist or an art director, and that person sort of adds their own vision and interests, which often makes for just a wonderful collaboration in the end.
How long do these photography projects typically take you?
Typically, you're spending a day in a home. Sometimes it's a half a day. There have been moments if you're shooting an 18, 20,000 square foot house, it takes a couple of days.
What about preparation ahead of time? Do you spend a lot of time before the session?
So yes, the way I work, which from what I understand is very different, and I think that stems from my design background, is I like to go pre-scout these projects. So I want to go see them, and I want to walk through them, and I want to learn about the light and how they work, and I want to learn from the designer and architect about the history of the project. And then I like to take sort of freehand scouting picks sort of what could be a potential good composition. However, maybe furniture has to move, or maybe a piece of art has to be brought in because in reality maybe a wall isn't that important, or it doesn't need a piece of art, but yet in the photograph all of a sudden that wall has become very important. So I like to go into a shoot having spent that pre-time planning, so when we get there and we're spending a half a day or a full day, we kind of know what the angles are going to be. We're not standing around talking about, oh, what if we do this, what if we do that, because ultimately architectural photographers are paid in chunks of time. We're not paid by how many photographs we produce. We're paid by the time frame with which we're working. And so, the most productive that we can be and the most highly polished images that we can get in that allotted time frame, the best case scenario is meant for everyone.
And do you have a team that works with you, like assistants?
I do not work with assistants. In the last few years, if you look at House Beautiful Architectural Digest and even, regional publications, you'll notice that the photography lighting is very sort of real. It feels sort of like cotton. You'll notice that none of the artificial lights are turned on. And so generally speaking, the light has this sort of ethereal feel to it. Now, so because of that, I'm generally working with natural light as best as I can. And so generally I'm almost blocking off windows so that way light coming into a room has a definite direction in the photograph. Every once in a while I have these light panel LEDs that I'll use in, say, a windowless bathroom or something like that. So because of that lighting scenario, there isn't a lot of equipment that is actually brought into the home. There's reflectors and bouncers and things like that, but not a lot of heavy lighting. And so working with the designer architect, you can kind of work well with fewer people.
Working with natural light in the way that you do, obviously you have to deal with things like high contrast between the level of light in a room and the light that's outside, if it's the middle of the day or something like that. Do you process in a sort of an HDR type style to balance those out?
No, what I'll do is I will produce 2, sometimes 3 separate exposures, but not in an HDR manner. I'll actually more in like a 1700s oil painter manner. I will sort of dabble in light hand painted between the different exposures. Each exposure will be a separate layer, and then I will paint in the light levels that I want. So almost like when you see those big oil paintings where the room is sort of very moody and there's a real feeling of where the light is coming in, and then the person on the floor that's working on something will magically have this light on them that appears from a window. It's sort of that feeling. Whereas HDR, you're basically, taking a medium light level and sort of blanketing it to everything, which in many respects can look fake and almost computer generated.
Would you say then that by doing it the way that you do, that you're aiming to bring a much more of a artist or painterly type feel to what you do?
Yes. I mean, one of the things that I don't know that a lot of people realize is there's actually a lot of creative decisions as well as technical expertise that happens after the photo shoot in post-production. You can really alter, completely the feeling of an image after the fact. And it's really remarkable the amount of control that one has.
Then, of course, we have to strike a balance between portraying the reality of the situation as it was and then turning it into something that could be significantly different. And for things like magazine articles, how close do you have to stay to being true to the original place? It's a bit like with food photography, where they take amazing photographs of McDonald's burgers, and when you go get one, it looks like somebody drove over it. Is there any tension between those two extremes, if you like?
You always want to honor the initial design, respect and feeling and mood. However, a photograph is a two-dimensional form, and the camera sees space very differently. One of the biggest, I think, mistakes people make in the beginning is they are shooting down into a room, which is sort of the perspective that one sees as you're walking through. But in architectural photography, the camera can never be pointing down or looking up. It needs to be level, not just side to side, but front to back. And so even if you just took an iPhone and you use, say, a door frame or window frame and lined it up with the edge of the iPhone, you'll see that if the phone is level, as you raise it, all you gain is basically ceiling. And as you lower it, you start to sort of feel like you're looking up. So there's sort of a sweet spot around sitting height level or belt height level. One of my favorite quotes is by British photographer Arnold Newman, and that is, great photography is 1% talent and 99% moving furniture. Because it's a two-dimensional form, things stack, and you have to understand the interplay of those elements in the camera, and you have to move them around in a way that they make sense in the camera. I mean, one of the most amusing things is if you're photographing a dining room and I'll be looking through the camera and I'll be directing someone to slide a chair this way or that way, and they'll be looking at me puzzled because it won't make any sense in the room. And I'll look up and kind of laugh, but in the camera, it makes sense.
In that article in the Professional Photographer magazine, you mentioned in there that the golden rule in architectural photography is, if I get this right, to photograph as if someone was sitting.
The scale of everything feels better at around, 30 to 42 inches off the ground. If you're up too high, again, because the camera can't look down, when the camera looks down, the furniture tends to look like dollhouse furniture. It gets disproportionate to the scale of the room. But so if the camera is about at that seated height, everything feels right in the architecture.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the marketing aspects of what you do, and we'll start with your clients. So your photography is very often used to help market your clients' own businesses, the interior designers, the architects, and that kind of thing. What do you feel are the main factors in your work that help them to do that better?
Well, architects and designers they're selling lifestyle. They're not selling a home. It's very different than, say, real estate photography, where you're trying to sell a home, and so therefore you're trying to give away as much as possible. In interiors photography, oftentimes less is more. You're trying to produce a beautiful, stunning composition, a beautiful photograph that sort of instills interest in someone. And so if this photograph is being used in an advertisement or on House on their website, someone might look at it and want to know more. It sparks something in them that they want to know more because you haven't given it all away. And I've also learned that the human eye fills in what they don't see. And so oftentimes if you give them bits and pieces, they will fill in what they would like to see. And I think designers and architects can use that quite well in their marketing.
And do you feel that that artistic, painterly approach that you have is another thing that helps them to make more of an impact on their websites and in their literature?
Yes, I mean, I sort of call it seeing the tree within the forest. I love going into a room and zeroing in on the relationships between the lines or the light or the contrast of objects, and then sort of stopping that down in time in a way that it's a beautiful photograph. I mean, regardless that it's a beautiful design, it's actually just a beautiful photograph, and there's sort of pleasure in viewing it. It's almost like a piece of art.
On a typical project, are you focused more on capturing an entire scene, like a room or something like that? Or do you take photographs of much smaller details, maybe a table or a specific chair?
There's sort of a balance. There needs to be some element of documentation that happens. And so typically what we'll do is we'll take the sort of bigger picture photo, and then we'll zoom in on a vignette or a detail within that larger picture to point out certain details or things that we find interesting.
I imagine that then helps to bring a sense of balance to the whole group of images from a project that could then further help your clients to market what they're doing and that kind of thing.
Yes, and that also plays out in, editorial in magazines. When you're reading a story, the story continues, but that story cannot stop in the photograph. And so oftentimes you'll see a photograph and you'll be reading and you can sort of glance at the photograph and understand where you are in the room, and you turn the page and there's another angle or another perspective of that room, and that continues in the editorial. And so it's very important that there's a flow there. And that is usually best worked out when it's done in bits and pieces as opposed to giving it all away at once.
Talking of marketing, let's focus a little bit on your marketing for your photography business. What would be your top 3 marketing channels, if you like, for getting the word out and communicating with your target audience?
Ultimately, it's what's most important is the relationships that you have with the designers and architects and builders, because you are in a very private home. You're in someone else's space. And so there has to be a matter of trust between you and that person. And so first off, that first marketing channel is just being out there, going to events, meeting and greeting people, and staying up to date with people and what's going on, so they feel comfortable bringing you into their client's home. Second for me, and third and fourth and fifth would be social media. Just social media is just a very powerful tool that I can actually monetize its use for me, because I can see how it works and I can see how it connects me and allows me the ability to market myself in ways that I can't imagine doing this without social media.
I don't think I've ever had anyone say that social media is their, second, third, fourth, and fifth preferred method, even though, it's one of those things that is so prevalent these days and everybody wants to make use of it. Let's take a little side detour for a second and talk about the social media aspect of this, because I get asked these questions a lot, especially from commercial photographers and people who are trying to market themselves to professionals. And they tell me things like, well, I've tried social media, but I find it really difficult. It doesn't work very well for me. I don't feel like I can reach the right people. Obviously, it sounds like you've managed to do that. What would you say are the top ways that you've used social media to make that happen?
So I use social media to promote the people that I work with, which sort of secondarily promotes myself. And so say if a designer has a feature in a magazine, I will use my social media channels to promote their getting published. And I'm very careful not to promote myself. I feel it's sort of understood, that obviously I was the one who took the photographs, but I use that to promote them, and then it's sort of reciprocal. Because if you promote them, they will promote you. And I've learned that by putting them first through social media, it pays dividends. Sometimes it's in the long run and sometimes it's in the short run. The clientele that I work with, designers and architects, they're very social creatures. They love to interact with each other. I find it fascinating. You'll go to industry events and there'll be 200 designers in the room and maybe 50 of them are fierce competitors, but yet they're eager to socialize and share stories and share resources with each other. And so you can use the social media to be a part of their group.
Yeah, I've seen that in action myself. I used to do some work with the American Institute of Architects, the Memphis chapter, where I would go and photograph some of their award ceremonies. And like you say, there would be all these designers and architects there at this huge gathering, and they would obviously, as you say, be competitors with each other, but they would be reveling in each other's success.
Yes.
There wasn't a sense of envy.
It's interesting to me in social media, if I promote designer X, 9 times out of 10, it's the other designers in their peer group that will comment or like or interact with that post. It's not like, my family or friends. It's the people who are their own peers who are interested in actively, saying just, good job, bravo, great work. It's very fascinating to me.
So we've talked a little bit about magazines a little bit here and there, and you mentioned that a lot of your work appears in magazines and that's kind of what it's destined for. How do you see the future of interior and architectural photography in that magazine space?
I would say about 4 or 5 years ago, I think there was a bit of nervousness amongst people in the industry. Many shelter publications had closed, unfortunately, and all of a sudden there was these pop-up digital design magazines, and that was a very fast, quick bubble. They sort of, I think there was maybe 14 or 50 of them that appeared, and then within less than a year, they all disappeared. And so I feel that the print industry is healthy and does have a long lifespan. I don't feel that digital will overtake print. I think that there can be a healthy balance between the two mediums because I do feel that people want to be able to sit on their couch with a magazine and turn the pages. They like the visceral feel of print. And so I feel that it will work and it will last.
What about a typical project? Because I'm really interested to learn about the life cycle of your typical project, as it were, from the time someone first contacts you to the delivery of the finished project. What does that process look like?
Personally, typically I'm booking 3 to 5 weeks out, and so I'll be contacted, and in 3 to 5 weeks we'll have set up a scouting visit. And so I'll go to the project, and like I said, I'll learn about the history of the project, and then I'll go around and take handheld scouting shots, which I will upload to my client. And then, depending on how involved they want me, I can spend a lot or a little time talking about the scouting shots, talking about what I feel could be brought in for staging and styling, what I feel could be added to make these images, really strong. And then on the day of the shoot, hopefully we've all spent enough time sort of immersing ourselves in what we're going to be doing that we can go from one shot to the next in order based on how the sun is moving through the house. And at the end of the day, I've produced, on average, say 14 really solid photographs in a day of shooting. Then I will go back, and there's quite a bit of backup involved because, it is a computer. And so I spend a lot of time just securing everything and making sure that it's in multiple places and nothing can ever happen to it. And then usually that night, I try to make it a point to just sort of lightly go through, maybe the room was a fire engine red or just some weird color that you want to make sure it was reproduced as accurately as possible. And the closer I do that to having been in the home, the more accurate I can be in reproducing that color. So I'll do a little bit of soft sort of processing, and then I'll sit down, and typically a normal shoot will take 3 to 4 hours of processing work. And then what I will do is I'll spend a solid 2 to 4 hours working on those files. And then I will send JPEG files as sort of proofs to the client. And they will go through and ask me to make additional alterations to them. And then what they will receive are the high resolution TIFF files as well as the high resolution JPEG files. And then those are then theirs for their usage. And every photographer varies on what type of usage is included and what type of usage is additional. Throughout the process, there's a conversation that happens about what the end game is. Is it the end game to get this published? Is the end game primarily, say it's a smaller project and we don't feel it has a lot of legs to get published? Is the end game to produce images that will be used in their digital portfolio, images that will be used on House, images that might be used if they blog? And so then it's sort of sitting down and having those images to work with and figuring out what's the next step. What magazine are we going to start with and see what happens? And if they say no, what magazine do we go to next? One thing that you learn very early on is you really don't shop projects to various magazines, because the downside could be, say, magazine X and a magazine Y both accept your project and they were to both to run it at, say, the same time. You would basically be blacklisted forever. So you have to do one at a time. And so there's a very long process in the actual being printed on the page part that can be frustrating and can take a lot of time. And part of that stems, magazines still operate in many senses the way they used to. Typically a publication house will produce 6 issues a year, and typically there are 4 features in that issue. So you're looking at 24 possible placements that your project can end up in one year. that's not a lot. And so you start to see how there is this sort of time waiting and hopefully it gets project, but oftentimes it gets published in the distance. And a lot of that also has to do with the feeling. If you're going to be in the November, December issue, there isn't going to be a home where the windows and doors open and there's daffodils and spring flowers. You're going to have a home that has a feeling of the fall or the winter. And so sometimes that is the driving force.
And of course, these articles, when the pieces are published in the magazines, it's not just the photography. Do you tend to work with the writers as well?
I do and I don't. When I'm pitching projects, I have learned that you can make a project a stronger sell if you work in conjunction with a writer, because the writer can kind of figure out what the meat is, what the story is. And then if you pitch it together to a magazine, they already, they're not just looking at pretty pictures. They actually understand, oh, this could be a really good story. And so I've learned that doing that in the beginning, teaming with a writer, can be beneficial. But once the story is accepted and, takes off, it's between the writer and the architect, the designer, and the homeowner. I sort of step back.
So for photographers who might be thinking about jumping into this field, making a business out of it for themselves, what would you say are the top 3 mistakes that new photographers might make?
Number one is to work for free. One of the best examples of advice that I received when I was starting out, it was a guy named Jim McGeo who owns a showroom and design center. And he said to me, Michael, you've been around for a long time. There's going to be a lot of designers who are going to tell you that they're going to help you. They're going to get you a break. They'll get you into a magazine. You're just starting out. They're going to give you advice and they expect to get something out of that, i.e. free photography. He said, don't do it. Stand your guns. Don't give away your services, because what will happen is people will lose respect and not necessarily value what you have to offer down the road when you feel that you should be compensated. And so that is tough to swallow in the beginning. I want to say that my first year I barely made $10,000, but I never gave anything away, and I feel that that added to a certain level of respect for what I was bringing to the table. So that's sort of number one. Number two is you have to understand that you are going into very expensive homes, and it's a private home. It's someone's house. And oftentimes I am in parts of a home that, these people's best friends maybe don't get to see. And so you need to, respect that. And so that comes down to going to industry events, introducing yourself to these designers and architects and builders, and getting them to know you as a person, getting them to learn to trust you. Because that's a big, big factor. I mean, most of my success in the beginning was, okay, Michael, we like you, we know you, we don't know if you're a good photographer, but we trust you. And then it was up to me once in the door to prove myself. But it was that, and of course, in my situation, it's very different. But I had those 16 years of sort of presenting who I was to a lot of people. And so they knew that they could trust me. Number 3 is just learning to work with editors and learning to, again, sort of introduce yourself to them and getting to learn to play the game. Primarily what you have to do is show them that you know what good design work is. They want to know that what you're producing is of a certain caliber, and so that way they are interested in what you're pitching to them. They don't want you to be showing them every single thing that you shoot, because not everything that you shoot is publishable. So they want to know that you have a certain sophistication to your eye and to what you're bringing them.
I think there's some really good food for thought there for people. So one last question before we finish up, and that is, if you could go back in time, I don't know if you're a Doctor Who fan, but if you could steal the Doctor's TARDIS and go back in time to when you first started out, what advice would you have for your earlier self?
My biggest advice for my earlier self would have been to listen to others and to be open for criticism and to not have been maybe defensive. I think in the beginning, Because I was self-taught, I was very intimidated by the process and intimidated by what was going on. I mean, in the beginning, I was working with very wonderful designers who had been, published in all kinds of magazines, and they were hiring me, like I said in the beginning, because they knew me and trusted me, but then it was up to myself to prove myself. And I was very intimidated by those situations, and oftentimes I sort of would become defensive and not listen to what they were trying to teach me. And I think that was one of my biggest mistakes. The biggest learning curve that I have gone through is learning to be sensitive to light and contrast, and learning to sort of really understand how a camera sees light and how it records it. And that honestly has taken me years to learn that, now I can look at something and say, oh, that's a little too yellow, or that's a little too blue, or look at the little cast of magenta in the corner. I need to color correct that. In the first couple of years, I didn't have the sophisticated enough eye to see that, and that just took time.
Michael, thank you so much. This has been truly wonderful. I've really enjoyed talking with you today about this. It's been great, and I wish you all the very best with your career. Thank you. You've been so generous with your time and your expertise here. I'm sure that it's going to be a great help to everybody that's been listening. So it's been wonderful to have you.
Well, thank you, Nigel. I really appreciate the opportunity.